Hello and welcome back. This is the week 10 lecture. So this is sort of a miscellaneous week for us. We have a couple of different things to get through. I want to talk about the American Renaissance in a bit more detail here today. That is a term that I have alluded to over the last couple of weeks. I've mentioned it in various ways, but I haven't really explained it. I haven't really offered a lot of detail. So I would like to do that now. And we're also going to take a look at this week just some examples of some popular texts from the middle of the 19th century. So we've kind of worked our way up to the 1840s now, sort of on the cusp of the 1850s. So we're looking at a couple of different things, some examples of old Southwestern humor, which was a popular genre back then. It's largely been forgotten now, but one of the reasons I want to mention it here today is because it serves as a really important forerunner or predecessor to a lot of the humor written by Mark Twain and sort of other more well-known American writers later in the 19th century. So Old Southwestern humor influenced Twain a lot. It influenced Flannery O'Connor and other Southern writers from the late 19th century and into the 20th century. So it's important from a historical standpoint, not read a ton today, but it is very influential. So we're going to look at a couple of representative examples of that genre. We're also going to revisit sentimental novels just very briefly. We're not going back to the coquette or any of those older seduction tales, but I do want to take a look at an example of a popular sentimental novel of the 1850s called The Lamplighter by Maria Cummins. We're not reading the entire novel. It's quite long. I just gave you a link to it so you can take a look at the first couple of chapters, maybe the first 2 to 3 chapters, just to get a feel for it. That was a very popular novel. Cummins was a popular author, but again, we're looking at it as a representative example of a larger genre or style. So you guys remember a couple of weeks ago we read Hawthorne, and we talked a little bit about him and his background, his bio, and I mentioned that although he was not by any means unknown during his lifetime, he really became more famous, more celebrated after his death. And that's going to be sort of a recurring theme with a lot of the authors that we read here in this current unit, as I'll mention in a moment. So Hawthorne was appreciated in his day. He was certainly known within New England. His work was reviewed. It was read. But he didn't become a celebrity. He never really grew wealthy off of his writing. He remained somewhat obscure during his lifetime. And there's a famous quote by him where he sort of laments the popularity of sentimental novels written in the style of The Lamplighter. So we talked about sentimental novels as a genre several weeks ago when we were doing The Coquette. And you might remember back then I mentioned that we use this label sentimental novel to really include a lot of different types of texts. The Coquette, for example, or Charlotte Temple, our first big, huge bestseller in U.S. literary history, those novels are similar, but they're quite different from, say, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the sentimental novel in the 1850s by Harriet Beecher Stowe that would finally surpass Charlotte Temple in total sales. But those were both classified as sentimental novels, even though Uncle Tom's Cabin had very different themes, different characters. It wasn't completely centered around seduction and the loss of young women's innocence. So they're different in terms of structure, plot, even in certain stylistic ways. But because they both featured heightened emotions, because they were both kind of designed to elicit the sympathy of readers, and because they were both written by women, and because they featured a lot of prominent women characters, they were classified as sentimental novels. And later, as we're about to see, sentimental novels were kind of classified as lesser artistic achievements compared to the works of Hawthorne or Melville or Poe or some of the other authors that we're looking at right around this point in the semester. So that's a big part of the historical process that I want to discuss a little bit today. But anyway, getting back to Hawthorne, he had a famous quote lamenting the success of sentimental novels like these. And he referenced the damned hordes of scribbling women, very much referring to authors like Cummins, like Stowe, and there were many others who were popular in the middle of the 19th century. Fanny Fern was another. These were best-selling authors, and their books did quite well, not just with women readers. They're often sort of thought of that way or described that way, but they had very broad readerships. They sold a lot of copies, and frankly, in their day, they were more popular than the short stories written by Hawthorne or a lot of the fiction being produced by the likes of Melville or some of these other authors that we're looking at now. So that's kind of the interesting push and pull, the sort of contrast that I want us to notice as we talk about the American Renaissance today. The texts that sort of later became celebrated and lionized and canonized as the best works of literature in the 19th century, they were not the works necessarily that were popular in their day. So the sentimental novels that were very popular during the time were sort of later neglected, not totally forgotten, but just not given the same level of scholarly attention and not viewed as the same kind of aesthetic achievement that some of these other works were. But the question of popularity looms. The Lamplighter was popular. Hawthorne would become more celebrated. So how do we navigate some of those differences between these sorts of texts? That's part of what I want to explore today as we get into the American Renaissance. But just a quick rundown of what I would like you guys to read this week. In addition to the first few chapters of The Lamplighter, we're looking at Letters from New York by Lydia Maria Child. She's another important literary figure from the middle of the 19th century. And then we're looking at some old Southwestern humor. Like I said, we're going to read just an excerpt from Simon Suggs, The Adventures of Simon Suggs, a very famous work of Southwestern humor that Twain definitely read. Flannery O'Connor definitely read it. We don't really remember the text so well anymore, but it has lived on in terms of its influence. We're also going to look at a couple of other examples of Southwestern humor. So let's start with the American Renaissance, and then we'll get into the text that we're reading this week. So I'm trying to keep the reading load a little bit light. I know we had a lot of Poe to get through last week, and many of you were probably still finishing up Edgar Huntley when we were reading the short fiction by Irving and Hawthorne just a couple of weeks ago. So hopefully we can use this week to catch up a little bit. We don't have a ton of reading, but it's an important week conceptually because we need to understand what the American Renaissance is, not just in order to better understand the middle of the 19th century when a sort of national literary scene finally begins to flourish in this country, but also so we can understand the real development of American literature as an academic field of study. That's a process that happens about 100 years after the point at which we are at right now in terms of our chronology. So around the middle of the 20th century, a bunch of scholars and professors, largely at elite academic institutions in this country like Harvard, other Ivy League schools, they sort of come together and they codify and develop sort of our modern conception of American literature as something to study, as something to possibly devote your life to as a scholar and an academic. So a lot of the concepts that I'm using this week sort of come to us from that era and from one sort of titan of American literary scholarship, in particular, F.O. Matheson. So I talk about him a little bit in the Week 10 overview. Matheson is the one who sort of coins this phrase, the American Renaissance, to refer to a particular moment in the middle of the 19th century when, in his eyes, in the eyes of a lot of other scholars working in the 1940s the 1950s, that's the moment when American literature really comes into its own, when we can really be said to have our own literary tradition and our own stable of really strong writers. So Matheson identifies a small group of American writers active at this time as sort of being, the fathers of our literature, of our literary tradition, and the ones who really write the first significant literary texts in the U.S. Now, keep in mind, we do not have to agree with Matheson. We do not have to buy into the mythology that he helps to create about this era and about these writers. We just need to know what he did and what he said. We are more than welcome to disagree with him and to find some fault with his ideas. And we're also going to notice that the American canon has been expanded since the middle of the 20th century. We're starting to include a lot more text. We're trying to make it more diverse because, of course, we'll notice right away, or at least we should, if we're looking at Matheson's sort of pantheon of great American writers from the mid 19th century, we're going to notice that they're all male and they're all white. Now, he does talk about some other writers, but the heavy hitters when it comes to his conception of the American Renaissance are typically thought of as Hawthorne, Melville, Walt Whitman, who we're going to read a little bit later. We're going to read Melville beginning next week, so we're going to get a feel for those guys. Definitely Hawthorne. Also Emerson. We're going to look at something by him. I think Thoreau is usually included in the group. And am I leaving anybody out? Hawthorne, Emerson, Thoreau, Melville, Whitman. I think those are the five that he focuses on primarily. Now, he kind of tries to incorporate Poe a little bit later. He does think Poe is very important, but he thinks of him as being a little bit separate from this other group, in part because Poe was a little earlier than them. He was no longer, I think Poe was already dead by the time at which, Matheson was really focused. So he kind of identifies this 5-year period between 1850 and 1855 as an especially fertile period in American literary history. This is an era where he thinks some of the most important works of American literature were produced. So I mentioned some of these titles in the week 10 module. The Scarlet Letter by Hawthorne, also The House of the Seven Gables, two very important novels by him coming out in 1850 and 1851. Moby Dick by Melville, published in 1851. Walden comes out in 1854, and Leaves of Grass in 1855. So Matheson identifies that half decade, that first half of the 1850s, as the period at which, again, American literature sort of blossoms and finally comes into its own as a unique and innovative and sort of artistically worthy national literary tradition. So again, we can dispute whether or not we agree that that 5-year period serves that particular purpose or function. Certainly, those are very significant texts. We continue to study those texts. Those texts have continued to be a part of the American literary canon. But I think we've already seen some reasons why more recent scholars have taken issue with Matheson's sort of, framework. We've already seen some pretty important writers from earlier eras. We've talked about Susanna Rowson, our first best-selling American author. We've read some important novels from the 1790s. And we also talked about Washington Irving, becoming sort of our first real literary celebrity, our first real literary export in the 1820s. Also in the 1820s, James Fenimore Cooper becomes pretty popular. We're not reading Cooper, but we are going to mention him a little bit. This is Last of the Mohicans, a pretty battered version, a pretty beat up copy. I don't know if you can see it, but he writes frontier romances beginning in the 1820s, adventure sort of stories that would serve in many ways as the templates for future westerns. So we're going to talk about frontier romance a little bit today, just sort of indirectly as we talk about Child, because she worked within that genre, as did a couple of the other authors that were at least briefly covering today, at least one other one. But that becomes a popular genre in the early 19th century. Again, the frontier, as we've already seen with Brown and what he does in Edgar Huntley, the frontier is very much at the forefront of the American imagination as the 18th century ends and the 19th century begins. So Cooper is also an important writer from a historical standpoint. I don't think he's especially good from an artistic or aesthetic standpoint, so we're not reading him, but he is influential, as I think we're going to see probably at other times in the semester. So there are some other popular writers that predate the Renaissance group, and there were already some important developments, as we've seen. We've tracked a lot of these early developments that were already in progress or had already occurred before we get to the middle of the century. But I think we can agree that Matheson is identifying some important texts and some important authors. But as I said, we've come to realize now in our contemporary moment that this is kind of an exclusionary club. This is a very selective, maybe too exclusionary in terms of who gets included in the American literary canon, who gets to be a part of it. And how limited might it be if we confine ourselves to just a certain kind of voice or a certain kind of authorial presence. We're going to see some diversity within this group. Whitman is certainly a little bit different from his peers in many ways. I think Emerson is. We're going to read those two together towards the end of this unit. But as I mentioned in week 10, we really began our American Renaissance unit in week 8 with Hawthorne. Irving is not typically classified with these guys because Irving was older. He really belonged to an older generation. Most of the Renaissance figures were born in the early 19th century. They were truly products of the 19th century. Irving was more of an 18th century guy. He was born in 1770, so he lived a long time, and he was writing up until the 1850s. So he was writing at the same time as a lot of these Renaissance figures, but he was considered a bit old-fashioned even in his own time by the end of his time. So he's not quite of the same generation, and in many ways he served as an inspiration and an influence in some ways for the Renaissance figures, but they come along a little bit later. They achieve their fame after Irving had already achieved his. And like I said, Irving largely left fiction writing, and later in his career he mostly worked on biographies, histories, travel literature, all of which is quite good. Irving's a very gifted stylist. You know, he can do a lot of different things, but he wasn't really producing a lot of fiction when once Hawthorne and Poe and a little bit later Melville and Whitman come along. So he belongs to an older generation, but as we saw, he helps to set the stage. And then the Renaissance era really begins with Hawthorne, Poe, and then we move up into Melville, Emerson, Whitman, Thoreau, all those other figures. And we're going to go through most of them. We're going to at least see a little bit from each of them over the next few weeks, with the possible exception of Thoreau. I don't know if we're reading him, but we're going to see Emerson and Whitman, and we're going to spend a whole week on Melville, and then we're going to spend a whole week on Leaves of Grass for Whitman, and then we're going to look at The Poet, I think, from Emerson. Those kind of go together. So we're going to experience a lot of these guys. We've already seen Hawthorne. We've already seen Poe. So I just want us to keep this concept in mind as we spend these next few weeks finishing up Unit 3. So we're kind of in the middle of it right now. So just remember the way these figures later came to be regarded roughly 100 years after their writing prime. Again, Matheson and these other scholars come together really right after World War II is when this process is really getting sort of codified and completed throughout a lot of U.S. academic institutions. So again, we take it for granted now that American literature is worthy of study at the college level, but it wasn't really accepted in the earlier part of the 20th century. If you were going to study literature at the higher education level, you were probably going to be looking at older literature, maybe works from antiquity, but possibly English literature, works from previous centuries, works from Europe. Those would have been deemed important enough, old enough, artistically relevant enough to warrant study. Whereas American literature, even in the early 1900s, was still kind of regarded as too new, too rough around the edges, not really established. We didn't have enough traditions. So Matheson is important, and the book that he wrote, called The American Renaissance in the 1940s, is very important because it helps to mainstream this idea that, hey, American literature is worth this higher level of study. It does need to become a subject or a field of its own that can be pursued in colleges and universities. Again, we take that for granted. We think it's always been that way, but it hasn't. It's a relatively recent development because American literature, of course, is relatively recent when compared to other nations. So Matheson and his colleagues do some good work, but again, there's a sort of limited perspective that we get from that original canon, dominated as it is by white, usually heteronormative authors. But again, Whitman's going to give us at least a little bit of an exception to that, and we can see some other possible exceptions. Melville can often be a bit subversive and not mainstream. We're going to talk about Whitman breaking the mold in various ways, but the canon has been expanded since Matheson was writing in the 40s. So just kind of be aware of this categorization. And again, think about the 5 heavy hitters that he focuses on the most: Hawthorne, Melville, Whitman, and then the 2 transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau. And then he kind of throws Poe in some of his later work. So just think about that group, think about what they mean, think about how we view them, think about their, larger role in the development of an American literary scene, but also remember that they were not always, and often cases were not, the most popular writers producing the most popular texts during their time. So what we're actually reading this week are, like I've mentioned, examples of more popular styles of literature, works that probably would have been read more, probably enjoyed a bit more in the 1840s, in the 1850s, compared to a lot of texts by Hawthorne or Melville or some of these others. So again, that's the dichotomy that we're sort of exploring this week. Popular versus what would later become critically acclaimed and later positioned as important texts that students of American literature need to study. So the open question that we're still kind of debating now is, do we need to spend more time as students of American literature reading sentimental novels from the 1800s, reading the popular stuff, reading the stuff that resonated more with middle-class readers, achieved higher sales? Do we need to wrestle more with popular fiction, the stuff that Matheson and his crew largely overlooked, dismissed, ignored? And we know that there were politics behind that, right? We can assume that since a lot of Matheson's work was getting done in the middle of the 20th century, we can understand that he was probably influenced by certain prejudices that would lead him to exclude women writers, that would lead him to exclude Native American writers, African American writers, non-heterosexual writers. But also, a lot of that stuff had not always been necessarily widely read or discovered, or was even necessarily always known to the wider reading public for some of those same reasons that I just listed. So now we can do more inclusive work, and we can hold up the original canon and sort of compare it to some of the new editions. But I'm always fascinated at looking at popular fiction on one hand, and then the stuff that we've been taught to regard as the best, and to notice that they are often different. I mean, they share certain traits, but what makes a text popular versus what makes a text celebrated by critics and scholars and held up as worthy of future study. So maybe think about some of those questions as you're looking at The Lamplighter and also the Old Southwestern humor. So I want to talk a little bit about this genre because it's a good example of this whole sort of distinction that I'm pointing to this week. Southwestern humor was quite popular in the middle of the 19th century, beginning as early as the 1820s and 30s up through the 1840s and 1850s, really all the way up to the Civil War. This stuff was often published in periodicals, so magazines and newspapers. These were often short sketches, short fiction, comic in nature, and they're often set in a very particular region of the U.S. So this is sort of early regional writing. And regionalism as a type of U.S. literature would become very prominent and very well known in the later 19th century. So that's not really a development that we're going to be tracking in this class. But when you guys take the second half of 451, you might see a little bit more about regionalism later in the 1800s. But Old Southwestern humor was a product of a particular time and place, but it was also very centered around the frontier. And we've already seen the centrality of the frontier in the American imagination with Edgar Huntley. We've talked about it, right? It was dangerous. It was viewed by a lot of readers as a sort of lawless zone where there were a lot of uncertainties, a lot of mystery, the constant threat of violence, a certain kind of geographical mystery. We talked about the sublime, the landscape often appearing sort of overwhelming, huge mountains, impenetrable forests, but just the unknown, untracked or unmapped territory, at least in the eyes of early U.S. residents, largely hugging the Atlantic seaboard, not really thinking about the Native American residents of those areas, but rather thinking of them as sort of empty spaces, wild spaces, spaces that needed to be tamed or civilized. So we object to a lot of that terminology nowadays, and we see things a little bit differently. But obviously this process, this ongoing process of clearing the frontier, fighting wars with Native Americans, and pushing ever more west, we know that's largely the story of the U.S. That's a huge part of our history, a huge part of our mythology, and obviously it becomes depicted in literature. So again, I mentioned frontier romance, the likes of Cooper, again, sort of influenced by Brown, interested in frontier conflicts, but streamlining it, making it a little bit more adventure-oriented, maybe taming some of the gothic elements and making it a little bit more of a swashbuckling, rousing affair. We mostly know Cooper now from some of the, I think, movie adaptations, largely from Last of the Mohicans, the movie that came out in the 90s, which I think is actually better than the book. If you've seen that movie with Daniel Day-Lewis running in the woods a lot, you kind of get a feel for what that whole genre was. It's a celebration of America's frontier past. Very much steeped in Native American legends and lore and history, but also very much this story that we've already begun to hear and see, going all the way back to Benjamin Church and the Puritans of New England. The white frontiersmen learning the ways of Native Americans and then using those techniques to help the whites defeat the Native Americans and take the land. That's very much what Cooper writes about. That's very much what frontier adventure romances were about. So this is increasingly becoming common material for fiction. So Southwestern humor is tapping into a lot of those same ideas, but they're not so much focused on the rousing adventure, all of that stuff. They're more focused on the lawlessness of the frontier. These are places where a lot of typical civic institutions had not been developed yet. There wasn't a lot of law and order. The traditional social hierarchies that you would have seen back east in major cities and older parts of the country were not yet present in frontier areas. So that led to sort of rampant criminality, a lot of, sort of role reversals, if you will. It was a wide open sort of free-for-all. So it didn't really matter who you were. It didn't matter what your background was. You could come west, at least this is kind of the idea. You can come west, make a new life for yourself, seize new opportunities. Again, a typical sort of American narrative, very much playing out in this time period. But again, this is humor. Old Southwestern humor is very much focused on the comic possibilities of having these kinds of fledgling democracies, these new settlements where things aren't really established and, firmly put in place yet. So there's a lot of raucous behavior, a lot of drinking, fighting, gambling, and like I said, rampant criminality. So that's what we see with Simon Suggs. The Adventures of Simon Suggs is a collection of short sketches by a writer named Johnson Jones Hooper. Who's very obscure. Nobody really remembers this guy anymore. He was a newspaper man originally from North Carolina, but he settled in Alabama as a relatively young man, worked in a newspaper, and wrote these sketches about a fictional character named Simon Suggs, Captain Suggs, a con man, a scoundrel, a confidence man, if you will. And Suggs, while not these stories are not widely read today. We know that Mark Twain read Hooper's Suggs stories, and was undoubtedly influenced by him. So I just wanted you guys to read one chapter from this larger collection of stories about Simon Suggs. Just one particular episode called "The Captain Attends a Camp Meeting." So this is very representative of the genre. And let me just talk about geography for a moment, in case we are a little bit unclear on what I mean by the Old Southwest. So I know nowadays when we think about the Southwest, we're thinking about Arizona, New Mexico, but in the 1830s and 1840s, you have to remember that those states were not part of the U.S. yet. This is pre-U.S.-Mexico War, and it's only at the conclusion of that war in the late 1840s that we acquire what is now considered largely to be the West. So in this older, smaller version of the U.S., the Southwest, as it was thought of by most Eastern residents, would be the states of Alabama, Mississippi, the western part of Tennessee, along with Arkansas and parts of Louisiana. So what we would just think of now as the South or the Deep South back then was considered the Southwest. And there's a clear reason why. Up until the 1820s and 1830s, there had not been a lot of white settlement in a lot of those places. Tennessee was already a state. We had already pushed beyond the Appalachian Mountains, but in the case of Mississippi and Alabama in particular, those states, what would later become those states, was largely under the control of Native Americans in the early part of the 19th century. The Creeks, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and it really wasn't until the 1830s, the dawn of the Indian removal period in the Southeast, it wasn't until then that white settlers had basically conned and robbed the Native Americans of their land. So settlement in those areas was really accelerating in this period. period. As we work up to the midpoint of the 19th century, a lot of people were leaving the East Coast and going to these new seeking new opportunities in what was considered new land, very fertile land, and what is now Alabama, Mississippi, parts of Louisiana, and Arkansas. It was very, there's a lot of haziness about land rights, and we're not going to get into all of that today. But again, this is a lawless kind of area, defined by criminality, a lot of land speculation, and often the settlers who were going out there were a bit disreputable. Not all of them, but many of them were sort of on the run, or maybe they had not amounted to much back in their previous homes, so they were seeking new opportunities in often unscrupulous ways. And that's the kind of character that we see in Simon Suggs. This guy is an opportunist. Like I said, he's a con man. He's often stealing, ripping people off, lying. He is not an upstanding, admirable character at all. But he is funny, and he's kind of clever, and he has a famous catchphrase that really sort of encapsulates what this region was like at this particular point in time in the second, third, and fourth decades of the 19th century. He likes to say that it's good to be shifty in a new country. And that's very much what he is. He's shifty. He has a lot of schemes, a lot of money-making schemes that we see play out in the sketches by Hooper. So, again, we're reading The Captain Attends a Camp Meeting. For those of you who don't know, camp meetings were a sort of Protestant Christian religious service that originated in England and Scotland. They're kind of evangelical events, but they later migrated to the U.S. as part of the Great Awakening, a sort of Christian revival in the early 19th century that spread throughout the U.S. But in the South, in particular in frontier areas of the Old Southwest, these were a pretty common staple. You would have preachers who would kind of travel from place to place, and you would have these big gatherings. They would often be pretty raucous, emotional events. A lot of singing, the saving of souls. And again, this is part of kind of a larger evangelical movement that's sometimes called the Second Great Awakening, that again swept through a lot of rural areas and particularly a lot of frontier areas in the U.S. So that's where Suggs is going. And again, he's an opportunist at heart. He's often referred to as Captain Suggs because he had previously served with a local militia group during a conflict with the Creek Indians, which is a real historical event but in Alabama during the 1830s. So Suggs is in Alabama. That's his particular corner of the Old Southwest. But he only joins the Tallapoosa Volunteers because he wants to take the opportunity to steal money and liquor from all of the alarmed citizens who are worried about recent attacks by the Creeks, the one of the Native American groups local to that area. So Suggs is a scoundrel. And we just see him get into various misadventures, and they're often played for laughs. So this is very typical of how Southwestern humor functioned. I just wanted to point out a few common traits that we see in the genre typically. We have a genteel narrator who's usually apart from the action, not usually involved in the events being depicted on the page. And that narrator usually kind of employs this ironic, detached tone, almost like he's sort of laughing at or judging the characters in the text. But at the same time, the narrator can also be a target of ridicule, and the satire, and these often are very satirical, that it kind of cuts both ways. If you remember Brackenridge, we sort of talked about how he does that too. The targets of the satire seem to be numerous. So yeah, in a lot of Southwestern humor, we seem to be invited to laugh at sort of lower class residents of the frontier and their very uncouth, ridiculous ways, but there's often other targets of the satire or the comedy. So in this example from Simon Suggs, we're definitely invited to view the camp meeting with some skepticism, and we're invited to laugh at some of the things that we see, right? The gullibility of the attendees. Suggs, in his observations, kind of points out a lot of the hypocrisy that might be a part of some of these camp meetings. He notices the one preacher who mostly officiates among the female attendees. There's some other things, that strike him as maybe not quite on the up and up. But of course, Suggs himself is very much not on the up and up. So I think we're supposed to laugh at Suggs. We're also supposed to laugh at the people he takes advantage of, but there's not really a clear moral authority at work in the text. It's a little subversive, and some people almost find Hooper's stories in particular, while funny, to also be almost a little bit nihilistic or maybe a little bit cynical about humans just sort of in general. But like a lot of Southwestern humor, we do have a narrator sort of standing outside of the action and commenting upon it, and often using irony to great effect. And also, most of these works of fiction are short. We would classify them as short stories. In their day, they would often be referred to as sketches. And they are brief and very comic in nature. They often don't focus a great deal on character development or delivering really complex messages, although I do think they're pretty good at pointing out certain absurdities, not just in frontier society, early frontier societies, but also the sort of urbane Eastern observers who in some sketches are revealed to be kind of foolish in their own right. So the genre kind of gets off the ground in the 1830s with the publication of Georgia Scenes by Augustus Longstreet. That comes out in 1835, I believe. Longstreet was a native of Georgia, sort of a schoolmaster, a teacher, later the president of a college. Very much a sort of genteel, old school kind of Southern writing persona, but Georgia Scenes sort of captures, again, uncouth, sort of Western Georgia frontier life in all of its bawdiness and violence. And it was funny, and again, sort of paving the way for future developments in what we would consider to be regionalism. And Longstreet very much likes to have a sort of urbane narrator who's standing outside of the action, but he's often sort of the butt of the joke as well. So he helps to kind of, codify the genre as it existed for the next few decades. And again, these sketches would often appear in newspapers and magazines, and then later, perhaps they would be collected into larger volumes, like what we see with Hooper. He later took a lot of his individual sketches of Simon Suggs and put them all together in the volume called Adventures of Simon Suggs, late of the Tallapoosa Volunteers. That came out, I believe, in 1845 and was a collection of a lot of those sketches. So, short, comic, we often have the ironic, detached narrator, but also we get really realistic depictions of frontier life, and we get vernacular speech. We hear frontier characters speaking as they really would have spoken. So again, this is kind of groundbreaking in some ways. It was mostly just thought of as fun and comic at the time, but it's helping to build some of the bridges that we would need to cross over to realism. Later, after the Civil War, realism becomes a more dominant style of writing after the Civil War in the late 19th century, but the old Southwestern humorists start this process. And Twain, who comes along later, but is certainly influenced by them, he's often given credit for helping to sort of make American writing more realistic. He's capturing authentic voices the way Americans really talk, the way everyday life really is. But again, these guys, these humorists, are starting to do that several decades earlier. So that's why they're worth mentioning and at least worth looking at a little bit. I didn't include anything from Longstreet, but you can check out some of Hooper's work. Also, a famous story called The Big Bear of Arkansas, published by T.B. Thorpe. I included that. It's not as funny, but it again kind of captures a lot of the popular characteristics of this genre, and it also captures this sort of folktale quality of a lot of these stories. Often the events that are being depicted can be considered somewhat outrageous or outlandish. So again, they're not quite realism as we would later come to understand the genre, but in terms of capturing certain details of frontier life and capturing the language of the types of people one would find in the frontier, these texts are groundbreaking. They're helping to create some templates that future writers would use. So you can check out the Thorpe story, and I also included a story from William Gilmore Simms called The Last Wager, another sort of southwestern themed story. Not especially funny in the same way that Hooper is, but Simms is another important southern writer from the antebellum period. A lot like Hooper and Thorpe, he's not remembered all that well today. He's not read all that much today, but he was a very popular writer in the 1840s, 1850s. He was kind of the South's preeminent man of letters, much more well-known than Hooper, for example, who remained pretty obscure, even though the Simon Sugg stories were popular, at least regionally. Simms was kind of known to a more national audience. He wrote novels, poetry, short stories, and like Poe, he was also a critic. He wrote some really important reviews of other American literary works. He knew Poe personally. The two of them reviewed each other's works. They were kind of pen pals. They corresponded a little bit. So Simms is a pretty important figure on a number of levels, even though we've largely forgotten him today. But he also worked a little bit in the Southwestern humor genre. So you can check out The Last Wager. Simms is interesting because he's often sort of theorizing and philosophizing about the art of literature, the writing of literature. And at the beginning of The Last Wager, he has this kind of long preface where he talks about realism, essentially, in literature. Like, how realistic should literature be? Or what exactly are we trying to capture? How fantastical should texts be? Sort of, and he's seizing on a question that Hawthorne would sort of visit, as these guys are writing important works of fiction, you have to remember that they're also helping to kind of figure out and establish different types of writing. They're starting to distinguish between different genres, different types of novels. Simms is also very interested in national literature, developing a national, unique, distinctive American literature. He writes about that. Hawthorne is interested in the differences between romance and realistic novels, which is a distinction that we've already seen a little bit. And even though we don't use his terminology now, he's talking about, his own works, his own novels, he classifies as romances because they contain supernatural elements and they're somewhat fantastical and sort of not always tethered to reality. And he's making a distinction between what he's doing and what a lot of the sentimental novelists are doing with their more realistic styles of novels. So, but we've maintained that distinction. We've just changed the language or the terminology. So we don't use the romance as a term to really incorporate sort of fantastical fiction. We just think of that as sort of like speculative fiction. right? Now we have categories for fantasy and sci-fi novels, and we would distinguish between those and more realistic novels. Now, for us, they're all novels, but the difference between realism and what we might think of as speculative fiction, that distinction remains, and it makes sense to most of us. So Hawthorne's interested in that. Sims is also interested in the differences between what he would have thought of as romance and more realistic fiction. But Sims is also very keen on developing a uniquely national U.S. literary tradition. He's actually part of a sort of, loosely defined group of writers in the 1840s. They call themselves the Young Americans, and they're sort of trying to develop techniques and strategies to create uniquely American literature, texts that could break away from the earlier European models. So one thing that Sims writes about in some of his criticism and sort of like literary theory, not really as fiction, but he talks about the importance of writing your region. If you're an aspiring writer in the US around the middle of the 19th century, in order to be national, Sims says, you need to be regional. You need to be focused on your unique corner of the country, because that place is distinctive from other parts of the country and from certainly other parts of the world. So again, he's not the first one to do that. We've already seen Irving do that, focus on the regional when he wrote about Old Dutch New York. We saw that Hawthorne was doing this when he wrote about sort of the history of New England. And My Kinsman Major Molyneux. We've even seen some earlier writers. Brown is kind of tuned into Pennsylvania, the greater Philadelphia area, the limestone caves, and the Native American conflicts of that particular area. So all of those writers were kind of doing what Sims would later describe, but Sims is the one who kind of writes it down and really calls attention to the need to really attend to regional differences, regional characteristics. And again, several decades later, this would become a recognizable, celebrated genre of American literature that many people would say is kind of unique to America. We kind of do regionalism differently than other countries, other literary traditions. So it's just important to remember that in the case of Poe and Sims in particular, they're not just writing fiction, they're also critics and they're theorists. So in addition to their own productions, they're also reviewing other people's writing, and they're helping us to kind of understand differences between genres. They're helping us to understand the novel as it was coming to exist at that time. They help us to understand the short story, Poe in particular. So Sims, Poe, Hawthorne, to an extent, they're all theorizing. They're all thinking about literature, the writing of literature, the writing of U.S. literature, and what all of that means. So in some ways, I would argue that Sims is very important for those reasons, almost more so than for any of the fiction that he wrote. But he was prolific. He was probably best known as a novelist and a poet during his time, but we like his short stories best now. His short fiction is the most accessible, the easiest to read, and we usually view it as, a little bit ahead of his time. He was very interested in Native Americans. He wasn't always accurate with his information about Native Americans, but in a lot of his short fiction, he tried to depict Native American milieus. He used Native American history and mythology in ways somewhat similar to Freneau, in that they were interested, but they were sometimes wrong about stuff, but they were interested. But sort of my final thought here as we wrap up Southwestern Humor is it's important to remember that this is a milieu and a geographical area that often gets glossed over in a lot of popular accounts of Southern U.S. history. The sort of lost cause propaganda that springs up after the Civil War largely kind of glosses over or ignores this period of Southern history. There's a really good historian and critic named James Justice who writes about this, and he says, after the Civil War, a lot of Southern writers reimagined the antebellum South as this genteel, courtly civilization dominated by aristocratic planters and contented slaves. And we know that that's almost all a fiction. Now, obviously, there were big plantations along the seaboard in the Old South, the old colonial South, which consisted of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. But as we've said, the stuff further to the west, like Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas, that got settled much later. And yes, later some big plantations were created out there, but that came a little bit later. That really wasn't in place until almost the dawn of the Civil War. Old Southwestern humor shows us an earlier period in this area that would later come to be thought of as the Deep South, as almost the most southern of all southern places. But the Old Southwestern humorists show us that back in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s, these were wild places of social disorder, a fair degree of chaos, drinking, fighting, gambling, and scoundrels like Simon Suggs. So that's not really the version of Southern history that the Lost Cause propagandist wanted to tell. So again, like Justice says, after the Civil War, we get this narrative that really doesn't line up with often reality. They, the post-war writers often ignored the wild frontier histories of much of the South. And again, up until the 1830s, a lot of that land was still controlled by the Creeks, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and parts of western Georgia, the Cherokee still had a lot of land holdings. You guys might remember from history class that in the 1830s, then President Andrew Jackson instituted the Indian removal policy. That was a national policy, but it was really geared towards the southeastern Native Americans, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, who were mostly in Florida. And it was an effort to essentially dispossess them of whatever land they still retained. And they were all forced to move west of the Mississippi River, largely to what is now the state of Oklahoma. So Southwestern humor is getting produced right around that time, during Indian removal, right before it, and then right after it. And a lot of these sketches were set in a slightly earlier period. So if they were written in the 1840s, they might have been set 20 years earlier or 15 years earlier. So they're depicting a lot of that history. Again, they're not so focused on Native Americans. They're not frontier romances like Last of the Mohicans. They're comedies, and they're almost exclusively focused on white settlers. But that's a different kind of South. That's a different kind of history from what we would later hear. But it's very influential, again, for the likes of Twain and Flannery O'Connor, other Southern writers who would come along later. They read that stuff. They read Sims. They read Hooper. They read a lot of the other humorists. And that a lot of those same, ideas, some of the same types of characters, some of the same types of absurd situations, even some of the irony, some of that double-edged satire would later show up in much more famous, more recent works. All right, so that's probably enough on the Old Southwest humor. So let's move on and talk a little bit about Lydia Maria Child. I included her letters from New York in the module this week, just to, we can't really do it justice. I just want you guys to read the first 4, maybe 5 letters, whatever I say, in the module. I give you a number just to get a feel for her style. And Child is an important figure just to talk about, at least briefly, because she wore many hats. So she was an important social reformer throughout the sort of middle portion of the 19th century. She also wrote some important fiction, but she's also remembered today, perhaps more than anything else, she's remembered and kind of credited as one of America's first modern journalists. And that's what we're actually looking at here with Letters from New York. These are sort of journalistic writings, a combination of reporting and sort of editorial writing. And they help to pioneer the whole concept of the weekly newspaper column in the U.S. So these letters were published over a period of time, and they were then later collected in 2 volumes. The first published in 1843, and the second published in 1845. So Child belonged to this same Renaissance generation. Just like Emerson and Hawthorne, she was born around the same general time. And she first kind of broke onto the literary scene with her 1825 novel, Hobomoke, I think is how you say it. A frontier romance, kind of influenced by some of the works of Cooper, like I've already mentioned, but Hobomoke has a much more sympathetic portrayal of Native American characters. And this kind of gives us an entry point into a lot of Child's preoccupations. So she was a champion of women's rights in the 19th century. She was also an abolitionist. She wrote quite a bit for the cause of the abolition of slavery. She was also an advocate for Native American rights. So she was a social reformer. And a lot of her fiction and a lot of her journalistic work reflected those larger sort of social concerns that she had. She was the editor of a pretty well-known abolitionist newspaper called the National Anti-Slavery Standard. And during the 1840s, while she was kind of running that paper, she began to write these letters from New York. She began to write them as if they were addressed to a sort of anonymous correspondent. They're often written in the second person, but she began to write those so they were written in the National Anti-Slavery Standard, her newspaper, which came to be known as one of the leading abolitionist newspapers in the U.S. during that time. But she was very prolific. She didn't just do journalism, and she didn't just write novels. She also produced short fiction. She produced a lot of children's literature, a lot of children's work, children's books, along with sort of, works of scholarship, really, criticism. She did a sort of scholarly study of religion called The Progress of Religious Ideas. She published that in 1855 at the tail end of that era that Matheson identified as sort of this really fertile time in American literature. So she was very active throughout the Renaissance era. Again, she belonged to the same generation as the Renaissance writers, but wasn't necessarily always held in their same esteem. But in more recent decades, we're recognizing what an influential and sort of versatile writer she really was. So the letters from New York that we're looking at, they kind of helped to gain her a wider readership in the 1840s. And she continued to be a pretty significant literary figure all the way up until her death in 1880. So like I said, these letters, many critics now will say that they kind of help to modernize American newspaper reporting. So they are largely based on her observations in Manhattan, the sights and the sounds of the city, but they're also editorials. They also give her opportunities to kind of reflect or explore larger ideas. So she's very reflective. She almost uses a kind of stream of consciousness style sometimes. And she's very observant. So, her eye goes to a lot of different places. Hogs eating garbage in the street to beautiful sunsets over the Battery. But she often uses the sights and sounds of the city as sort of springboards to explore these larger truths, to kind of ruminate on larger questions about our rapidly changing society, the ways that we interact with one another. A lot of critics think that she's kind of exploring the spiritual struggle that some people might experience in urban life, with city life. Navigating the various trials and tribulations of a rapidly growing, rapidly modernizing city. So we kind of talked about this a couple of weeks ago with Irving. The first half of the 19th century was a time of great, rapid change. The Industrial Revolution is really kind of kicking into overdrive, and we see this pattern of a lot of people leaving their farms, leaving their rural backgrounds to move to the city. Again, Hawthorne was talking about that. We saw that with Young Robin. Even though that was set in an earlier time, it very much reflects what was going on when Hawthorne was writing. Irving was also interested in that. How long can a place like Sleepy Hollow stay separate from the rapid modernization that's, sweeping through the country, and kind of that, that rapid modernization is kind of smoothing out certain regional differences, right? Old Southwestern humor is, again, sort of operating at this hinge point right before these wild frontier areas just become new states. They just become new national spaces. And in time, they lose a lot of those unique regional characteristics. So Irving, Hawthorne, Sims, all of these writers near the middle of the 19th century, they're interested in that development. They're interested in what happens when a lot of change occurs and we kind of lose the old, unique, regional distinctiveness. So they want to capture some of that distinctiveness before it goes away, because that's going to be a part of our mythology, our history, and of course, our literature. So that's a big ongoing thing that's sort of happening throughout these decades, and Child is sort of tapped into that as well. But another thing to remember about her, and this is interesting, she's often kind of lumped in along with other sentimental writers, even though that's a bit of a disservice. She's doing a lot of different kinds of writing. But one thing she is very interested in is the idea of spiritual and moral growth. Much like a lot of the sentimental writers thought that if you read literature that evoked feelings of sympathy, if you were invited to feel sympathy for characters or to arrive at a greater understanding of certain social problems, perhaps. That's very much what Stowe's doing in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Let's not just feel sympathy because something bad happens in kind of an individual way to a character. Let's think about larger social problems and all of the people they affect. Let's feel bad about that. Let's feel sympathetic maybe to entire classes of people. But by feeling that way, by gaining a greater understanding of these characters and feeling sympathy for them, we can arrive at a sort of, more elevated moral state. That was the idea that a lot of sentimental authors were pursuing. So Child is kind of doing that as well with her letters, because she thought that if you wanted to achieve moral growth, you could not do that in seclusion. You could not do that sitting alone in a room. You had to immerse yourself in social settings. You needed to be around other people. You needed to open up to other experiences, to other people, other ideas, and that's going to make you feel sympathy. So this comes back to that idea of sympathy and the idea of sentimentality, making us feel heightened emotions, making us feel sympathy for the characters on the page, whether they be fictional or the people that we could conceivably rub shoulders with in any teeming metropolis. So Child is kind of doing that. She creates this epistolary framework. Like I said, she uses the second person to kind of address this unnamed fellow correspondent, and she's kind of sharing these emotionally revealing details of life in Manhattan, the experiences that she's observed and had. But remember that these letters are driven by this sense of kind of moral duty. This idea that through better understanding the city and better understanding the people living there, we would have a better chance at social reform, because that's always kind of, at the forefront of her goals and her writing, social reform. So there are a lot of morally disordered aspects of society, both on the frontier, as we've seen, and in these big cities, where you have rampant poverty, major wealth inequality, immigrants coming to the city, occupying lower social stations, in some cases people coming from the farm and occupying lower social stations. So she's aware of all that. She wants to do something about that, but again, she thinks that we need to learn more about each other. We need to exist in these larger kind of social spaces, understand more aspects of city life in order to feel the kind of sympathy that we need in order to achieve social reform. So the letters are part of that larger project of hers. Okay, so I had every intention of keeping this lecture a lot shorter than last week. I do think I achieved that, but we still ran over an hour, so I'll go ahead and wrap up now. But just keep the American Renaissance in your mind. Keep that concept in mind, and remember that group of authors that Matheson highlighted around the middle of the 20th century, because I want to hear what you guys think about that group and about their centrality to American literature as a whole. And also, I want to know what you think about expanding the canon. Have we expanded it enough? And what are some additional text or some additional authors that we might need to include? All right, so that's it for this week. Next week, we'll start on Melville.